Kanawha County, West Virginia, October 3, 1879, 6:30 in the morning. The fire in the forge had been burning since 4. Thomas Cade, 41 years old, had been a blacksmith for 23 years, and he knew before he touched the bellows whether a fire was ready by the color of it. Not the brightness, not the height, but the color in the deepest part of the bed, the place where the coke compressed under its own weight and turned from orange to the particular blue-white that meant the forge was at working temperature. He had built that fire himself, the way he built every fire, and by 6:30 it was where it needed to be. He had work to do. He had always had work to do.
Kanawha County in 1879 was coal country in the early stages of becoming what it would be. The tipples going up on the ridges, the rail lines pushing south and east, the demand for ironwork multiplying faster than the smiths available to meet it. And Thomas Cade's shop on the south side of the Charleston Road had not been short of orders since 1871. What he had in front of him that morning was not an order. It was a piece of metal approximately 14 inches long and 4 inches wide at its broadest point, tapering at one end to what appeared to be an edge, and at the other to a blunt, slightly curved terminus that he could not assign to any tool form he recognized.
It weighed, by his estimate, somewhere between 8 and 10 pounds. Heavier than it looked, which was the first thing wrong with it, because Thomas Cade had been handling iron and steel in various forms for 23 years, and he knew by the weight of a thing what it was made of. And this thing was made of something he could not name. He had picked it up the previous afternoon from James Whitaker, a driller working the No. 7 operation for the Kanawha Salt Company, who had found it wedged in a lateral fracture at 212 feet below the surface during bore expansion. Whitaker had thought it was an old tool someone had dropped and asked Cade to look at it. Cade had looked at it for 10 minutes in his shop the evening before and gone home with it on his mind. He was going to melt it down and tell Whitaker what it was made of. That was the plan. That was what a blacksmith did with an unknown piece of metal. You put it in the fire and you watched how it behaved, and the behavior told you what you were dealing with. Iron behaved one way, steel behaved another. Brass and bronze and copper behaved in ways he knew as well as he knew his own name. He had melted down every kind of metal that moved through a working county in the 3rd decade after the war, and he knew what all of them looked like under heat. He set the piece on the fire, positioned the bellows, and waited. 3 days later, it was still there. And Thomas Cade had begun to understand that he was not going to be able to explain what he had in his forge. But here is what the Smithsonian Institution has spent 146 years making sure you never ask about. Kanawha County in the autumn of 1879 was the industrial center of the emerging West Virginia economy. The salt works that had operated along the Kanawha River since the 1790s were being steadily displaced by coal extraction, and the drilling operations that had originally been sunk for brine were being redirected, deepened, and expanded to reach the bituminous seams below. The Kanawha Salt Company was one of the last major salt operations still running in the county, maintaining 7 active drill sites along the southern bank of the river between Charleston and Maiden. Its No. 7 operation, where James Whitaker worked, was a lateral expansion of an older brine shaft, a bore running at an angle into the limestone substrate to test for secondary salt deposits. The work was routine. The depth was not unusual. What Whitaker found at 212 feet was not routine and could not be accounted for by anything in the geological record of the Kanawha Valley. James Whitaker was 28 years old, a 3rd-year driller from Nicholas County who had come to Kanawha for the salt company wages and stayed for the coal company wages when the salt operations started contracting. He was not, by the account of the men who worked alongside him, a man given to invention or exaggeration. He found the object wedged in a fracture in the limestone wall of the lateral bore at approximately 7 in the morning on October 2nd, and pulled it free with a pry bar before he had fully registered what he was looking at. He thought it was an old iron tool, perhaps a draw knife or a broad chisel of unusual design, that had somehow worked its way into the fracture through a higher bore that no longer existed. This was not an unreasonable hypothesis. Old tools turned up in deep workings from time to time, left by previous operations or washed down through fracture systems. He carried it out of the shaft at the end of his shift and took it to Thomas Cade, because Cade was the man in the county who could tell you what a piece of metal was. Cade looked at it that evening and knew immediately that it had not come from a previous drilling operation. The surface was not corroded. A tool lost in a brine-bearing limestone formation at depth would have shown significant surface corrosion from the mineral content of the groundwater. Chalky deposits, pitting, the particular orange-brown staining that saltwater contact produced on iron over time. This surface showed none of that. It was dark, close to black, with a faint iridescent quality in certain angles of light that he had never seen on any ferrous or non-ferrous metal in his experience. The edge, the tapered end, was still sharp. Not sharp the way a recently ground tool was sharp, but sharp in the way that a surface stays sharp when it has not been in contact with anything hard enough to degrade it. At 212 feet below the surface of Kanawha County, in a lateral bore through limestone that had been sealed since the last glacial retreat, the edge had not encountered anything hard enough to degrade it, because nothing had touched it since it was made. He put it in the fire on the morning of October 3rd and began to work the bellows. The first hour produced no change. This was not immediately alarming. Some alloys required extended exposure to reach working temperature, and he had encountered dense bronzes and high-carbon steel forgings that needed 45 minutes in a properly maintained fire before they showed any sign of movement. He increased the draft with the bellows and maintained the temperature. By the end of the second hour, the coke bed was at the color he associated with forge welding heat, the point at which iron became plastic and steel began to show the first signs of flowing. The piece had not changed color. It had not changed surface texture. It sat in the fire at the same black-dark iridescence it had shown on his workbench the evening before. He checked the temperature of the bed with a test rod of known composition, a half-inch square bar of wrought iron, and the rod came out within 90 seconds, showing the yellow-orange of working heat. The piece from the bore came out unchanged. He sent word to James Whitaker that afternoon that he needed another day with the material. The second day he brought in Amos Petrie, who ran the only other working smithy in the Charleston area, on the north side of the river near the rail yard. Petrie was 53 years old and had been working iron since before the war, in the machine shops of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and then in private practice in Kanawha County since 1858. He had a reputation in the valley for being able to identify any metal alloy by its behavior under heat and hammer. Cade laid the piece out on the workbench and told him what 3 sessions in the fire had produced, which was nothing.
Petrie picked it up, turned it in his hands for a long time, set it down, and looked at Cade. He said he wanted to try the hammer before the fire. He put the piece on the anvil and struck it with a 2-pound cross-peen hammer at full extension. The hammer bounced. Not deflected, bounced, with a ring that neither of them recognized as the ring of any metal either of them had worked. Petrie struck it again, harder. The same ring. The same complete absence of deformation on the surface. He struck it 6 more times at varying angles and with varying force, and when he was finished, the surface of the piece showed not a single mark. He handed it back to Cade and said he had never seen anything like it, and he was not going to speculate on what it was. He left the shop. He did not return. Cade put the piece back in the fire on the afternoon of the second day and left it there overnight, with the fire banked down to maintain a sustained lower heat.
Some metallurgical processes responded not to peak temperature, but to extended exposure at moderate heat. Case hardening of steel relied on this principle, and certain bronze alloys showed better response to long, slow heat than to intense, short firing. He came back on the morning of the third day and checked the fire. The fire had done what the fire always did. The piece had done nothing. He took it out with tongs, set it on the workbench, and looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up his field notebook, the ledger he used to record material specifications, job costs, and the particular properties of unusual pieces he encountered in his work, and wrote down what 3 days of professional effort had produced. He wrote the date, he wrote the physical description of the piece, he wrote the results of the hammer test, he wrote the results of 3 fire sessions at different temperatures and durations. He wrote, "Does not respond to forge heat at any temperature I can achieve. Does not deform under hammer. Surface unchanged. I do not know what this is." That last sentence cost him something. Thomas Cade had been a working blacksmith for 23 years. The forge was his epistemology. The fire told him what things were made of, and what the fire told him he could rely on. For 3 days, the fire had told him nothing. That was not a gap in his knowledge. That was a gap in the known properties of metal. He returned the piece to James Whitaker on the afternoon of October 5th with his written observations, and told him what had happened. Whitaker looked at the notebook page and asked what Cade thought it was. Cade said he did not know. Whitaker asked what he should do with it.
Cade said he had no recommendation and that in his professional opinion, the piece should be examined by someone with more analytical resources than a county blacksmith possessed. Whitaker took it to the Kanawha Salt Company's site superintendent, a man named Edward Gorell, who was not a metallurgist but who understood that an object found at 212 feet in a sealed limestone formation warranted attention beyond the operational routine. Gorell sent a letter to the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington on October 9, 1879, describing the find and requesting guidance. He enclosed Cade's written observations. The letter is in the Bureau's incoming correspondence file for the fourth quarter of 1879, catalogued at the National Archives in Washington, Box 44 of the Bureau's early administrative papers. The letter exists.
The response to the letter does not appear in any file Gorell maintained, and the Bureau's outgoing correspondence for the same period shows no letter to Gorell or to the Kanawha Salt Company. What appears instead is a field operative's expense report filed with the Bureau in November 1879, listing travel to Charleston, West Virginia in the 3rd week of October. The operative is identified by initials only in the expense report, H.W. No full name. No field report associated with the travel. The expense report lists lodging for 3 nights, meals, and 1 entry described as materials transport, a charge associated with the movement of a physical specimen. The amount claimed for materials transport was $4.60, which in 1879 was the standard freight rate on the Baltimore and Ohio line for a shipment of between 30 and 50 pounds from Charleston to Washington. A piece of metal weighing 8 to 10 pounds does not cost $4.60 to ship from Charleston to Washington in 1879. A piece of metal weighing 8 to 10 pounds, packed in a wooden crate with documentation and protective material, does. The expense report is in Box 44 alongside Gorell's letter. The field report that H.W. would have filed, describing what he examined, who he spoke with, and what he removed, is not in Box 44. It is not in any adjacent box. It is not in the Bureau's indexed field reports for 1879 and 1880.
A Freedom of Information request filed in August 2018 by the researcher Gordon Ashby, the same Morgantown researcher who identified the specimen log gap for the Alderson farm find 8 years earlier, requesting all Bureau field reports associated with West Virginia visits in the calendar years 1879 and 1880, produced 6 documents. None of them originated in Kanawha County. None of them referenced a metallurgical specimen.
The expense report for H.W. in October 1879 was not among the documents produced, which means the Smithsonian's search of its own records did not surface a document that is physically present in a box in its own archive. Ashby found the expense report on a subsequent visit to the National Archives reading room in 2019, in the box where it had been sitting since 1879. 3 other documented encounters with anomalous metal objects in the Ohio River drainage during the same decade established that the number 7 bore find was not isolated. In August 1874, a farm laborer named Calvin Morrow uncovered a curved metal fragment during fence post digging in Muskingum County, Ohio, at a depth of approximately 4 feet, inside a burial mound that had been eroded by a seasonal creek. The fragment was taken to a professor at Denison University in Granville, who described it in a letter to the Smithsonian as being of extraordinary hardness and of unknown alloy composition. His letter is in the Smithsonian's accession files. There is no record of a response, and no record of a specimen being received. In 1881, a mining crew working a copper prospect in Ontonagon County, Michigan, pulled a flat, rectangular plate from a quartz vein at 60 feet. Its surface covered with linear, incised markings. The crew's foreman submitted a written description to the Michigan Geological Survey. The survey acknowledged receipt. The survey's own files for 1881 through 1883 show no follow-up and no specimen. And in September 1885, a well digger in Ross County, Ohio, found a socketed metal implement in a clay formation at 38 feet that he brought to the county seat and showed to the local physician, who described it in a letter to the Ohio Historical Society as resembling no known tool type and as being impervious to any cutting or filing he attempted. The Ohio Historical Society's incoming correspondence for 1885 lists the letter. The letter itself is not in the file. The entry is, received September 22, 1885, R. Hull, Chillicothe, re. metal implement, forwarded per instruction. Forwarded to whom? Per whose instruction? The entry does not say. 4 finds. 4 professional men outside any institutional framework, each with the specific competence to assess what they had. 4 encounters with materials that resisted every analytical tool available to a 19th century craftsman. 4 times the object moved to Washington and the record closed. The framework that accommodates what Thomas Cade spent 3 days failing to melt is not the one published in any American textbook of pre-Columbian North America.
The official framework assigns no metallurgical capacity to any population in the Kanawha Valley at any point in the pre-contact period beyond the cold hammering of native copper by Adena and Hopewell culture workers beginning approximately 3,000 years before present. Cold-hammered native copper, copper worked without smelting, shaped by repeated impact into flat forms, cannot produce an edge that remains sharp after 10,000 years in a sealed limestone bore. It cannot produce a surface that resists forge heat at any temperature achievable in a mid-19th century blacksmith shop. The gap between cold-hammered native copper and an object that bounces a 2-pound hammer without marking is not a gap in degree. It is a gap in kind.
The Tartarian hypothesis names a pre-Columbian civilization operating across North America with metallurgical capabilities that the official timeline does not assign to any population in this hemisphere before the arrival of European industrial technology. The Kanawha Valley object belongs in that framework, not as speculation, but as a data point. The object existed. Thomas Cade held it in his hands. He tried everything he knew. He wrote down what happened. The framework that the official record uses to explain the pre-contact Ohio drainage cannot accommodate what he wrote. The Tartarian framework can.
The object went to Washington before any independent analysis could be performed. The record closed. That sequence is not evidence against the framework. It is consistent with it in every particular. The closest metallurgical parallel in the global record is the Iron Pillar of Delhi, a forged iron column 23 feet in height, weighing approximately 6 tons, that has stood in open air in the Indian subcontinent since the 5th century of the Common Era, without any surface corrosion consistent with its age and exposure. Modern metallurgical analysis of the pillar has identified an unusual composition of slag inclusions that produces a passive corrosion-resistant layer on the surface, a phenomenon not reproducible by any documented ancient Indian metallurgical process, and not fully understood by modern materials science.
The pillar demonstrates that pre-modern metallurgy in other parts of the world produced materials with properties that exceed what the official timeline assigns as possible. The object from the number 7 bore was not from the 5th century. It was from a sealed limestone formation at a depth and geological context that places its manufacture significantly earlier. Its surface properties, as Cade documented them, exceed even the Delhi pillar's resistance to thermal degradation. The comparison does not explain the Kanawha County object. It establishes that the properties Cade described are not physically impossible. They have a parallel. The parallel is in New Delhi, standing in open air, and the Smithsonian's curators have seen it. The Kanawha Salt Company's former number 7 site now lies beneath the service road for a natural gas compressor station operated by a subsidiary of a pipeline company whose regulatory filings in West Virginia list 14 Delaware-registered LLCs as co-owners of the land package that includes the former bore coordinates. The compressor station has been in continuous operation since 1978. The land above the number 7 bore is classified as active industrial infrastructure under West Virginia Surface Use Law, which exempts it from the historical site access provisions of the National Historic Preservation Act. No historical researcher has filed an access request. The exemption has never been tested at this location. The compressor runs day and night. The ground beneath the service road has not been disturbed since 1978, or if it has been disturbed by parties who do not require a historical access permit because they already own what is under it. The registered addresses of the 14 LLCs that collectively hold the land package trace, through a layered chain of registered agent relationships, to 2 corporate services firms in Wilmington, Delaware. One of those firms appears as registered agent for 43 other LLCs holding former industrial parcels in the Kanawha and New River drainages of West Virginia. The second appears as registered agent for 31. Combined, the 2 firms manage registered agent relationships for 74 LLCs holding land above former salt, coal, and mineral extraction sites in the 2 drainages. None of the 74 LLCs show active commercial filings. None generate recorded revenue. All of them pay annual registered agent fees, state fees, and property taxes on land that does nothing. The annual carrying cost of that portfolio, at current West Virginia assessment rates, is not a small number. It is a deliberate expenditure. Someone has decided, for at least 47 years, that maintaining control of the ground above these sites is worth more than whatever that ground could produce commercially. Thomas Cade worked his forge on the Charleston Road for 23 more years after October 1879. He never encountered another piece of metal he could not identify. He mentioned the piece from the number 7 bore once, in 1897, to his son Henry, then 18 and learning the trade. He told Henry what he had tried and what had happened and what he had written. Henry asked what the piece was. Thomas Cade said he did not know, and that not knowing was the only honest answer a craftsman could give when the evidence did not resolve. He had been a blacksmith for 40 years, and the fire had never failed to tell him what he was working with. Whatever it had been telling him during those 3 days in October 1879, he had not had the framework to hear it. He went back to the forge, and he worked until 1901, and retired and died in 1903. The notebook went to Henry, and from Henry to the Kanawha County Historical Society in 1941, along with a note from Henry that his father had called it his most important professional record, though Henry had never understood why. Henry Cade understood what his father meant in 1879 and did not understand it in 1941. The distance between those 2 moments is the distance between a man who held the object in his hands and felt its weight and watched his fire fail to move it, and a man who heard the story secondhand and put the notebook in a box and drove away. The notebook is still in the Kanawha County Historical Society. The notation is still on the page Thomas Cade wrote on the evening of October 5, 1879. Does not respond to forge heat at any temperature I can achieve. Does not deform under hammer. Surface unchanged. I do not know what this is. Thomas Cade, 41 years old, October 3rd, 1879.
His hands on the bellows, the fire at the color he had been reading for 23 years. The piece from the bore sitting in the deepest part of the bed, where the coke went blue-white and iron always moved. He watched the piece. The piece did not move. He worked the bellows again. Whatever had been waiting at 212 feet below the Kanawha Valley in sealed limestone, since before any civilization the official record places within reach of this county, it had been waiting in perfect darkness for longer than the official record allows. 3 days in Thomas Cade's forge did not trouble it. The expense report for its removal is in Box 44 at the National Archives. The field report for its removal has been gone since 1879. The object is somewhere in a federal collection that will not confirm it was ever received. In Ravalli County, Montana, 44 years later, a woman with a drawing pencil would have 2 days to record what she found before the Army took that.